Hello and a very warm welcome to the programme. Apple is being criticised for taking down an app being used by Hong Kong's protesters. Putting profits above human rights is wrong, was how one top US politician put it. But the question remains, do tech companies actually have any kind of duty to protect our rights? You're watching Roundtable. It is good to have your company. I'm David Foster. The HKMapLive app was being used by Hong Kong's protesters to track the movements of police, the use of tear gas and other things in their long-running battles with the authorities. It was taken down by Apple. Its critics suspect that China had intervened.
Since June, these images in Hong Kong have become all too common. Protesters marching across the city in defiance of a government extradition law. And they're using technology to help them. Laser pens and smartphones, for instance, to avoid being monitored. An app called HKMapLive that tracks police movements and tear gas use. But in October, Apple removed the app from its platform, saying that the app has been used to target and ambush police and threaten public safety. US lawmakers said Apple has censored at least 2,200 apps in China. Critics have argued Apple has acted after pressure from Beijing. But what about human rights? Is there an app for that?
Let's get the conversation going. Joining us from Hong Kong, we have the cybersecurity expert Leonard Weiss, who's been involved in the protest. At the Roundtable, tech journalist Jeff White. Jan Penfrat here, policy advisor at European Digital Rights, and Glyn Moody, a digital rights expert. Jolly good to have you all along with us. Leonard, let me come to you first since you're on the ground. You've been out on the streets in recent days. Are you still using high tech to get around and find out what's going on?
Yes, we're using maps to find out where police are, where people are being attacked by organized criminals. We're using chat groups to find out what the best strategy might be. We're using online forums to more reflect and share information. We're very much using technology and very much depending on this technology.
Let me just remind everybody, this Hong Kong Map Live, the app has been taken down, but you can still access it through a browser, correct?
If you downloaded it in the brief period that it was available, you can still use it. If you have a browser on your laptop, on your phone, you can also use it through that.
And is it possible that the authorities themselves could well be planting information on these sites to mislead you, that they could be using it in the same way that you think you're using it?
That is possible, but it is also possible to report false information. And the damage from believing that police is around the corner when it is actually not is not very high. The risk is far higher from police planting themselves inside of the groups of protesters to then inflict violence against bystanders or against other protesters.
What do you reckon? Is it giving you an advantage?
Very much. Technology is very much in the hand of the young people who know how to use it. The government, these institutions, the police, they have trouble using these new tools that are very much, unused by them, but that young people just know how to use natively.
But if I could just put out the point there that no other protest up until this one has relied as heavily, would you agree, on technology as what we're seeing on the streets of Hong Kong?
Well, I'd say all protesters now are increasingly getting the hang of using apps to find their way around, to communicate. And what's interesting about the Hong Kong protests is there's been a shift from the protests of a few years ago where Facebook and Twitter were very heavily used into these more encrypted apps. But that's reflecting a general sort of societal shift, you know.
And the fact that this is a very young protest movement.
So they would be savvy.
So they're very savvy, which is the reason that.
Yeah.
The other thing is that for all of the authorities' ineptitudes, according to Leonard, that there have been sort of attempts to push back. it's interesting that on both sides, the activity has been high-tech but also low-tech. So you have protesters, for example, using umbrellas and sticking boxes over the tops of cameras. You also have the police thinking, well, we can't necessarily shut down these groups, but we can try and find the person who runs these discussion groups and just go and arrest them and try and intimidate them. So that sort of stuff's been going on.
And,
So,
and you reckon also, just a moment with you, you reckon it's partly because we're seeing a generational
Absolutely.
shift. I mean, I happen to think it's also because we are seeing so much of Hong Kong in the headlines that we are highlighting.
I think if you look at the people taking part, they're clearly young people. For them, they are digital native. This is just absolutely second nature. And therefore, for them, it's the natural thing to do. They use it very quickly. And most importantly, they change very quickly. Older people take time to change. These young people can turn on a sixpence. They can actually rewrite their software, or they can adopt new methods. And that's crucially important in responding to the police when they do come up with some way of actually fighting back.
Apple apparently said it had been contacted by, quote, concerned customers who thought it might endanger law enforcement and the local residents. Do we believe a word of that?
Yeah, I personally wouldn't buy it because, I mean, even according to the official statements that Apple had made, most of the reports that they have gotten about illicit use of the app came from Hong Kong authorities. And that is not the most trusted source, if you have them being one of the parties in this conflict. I would also like to put in a word of caution with regards to how young people use technology. As impressive as it is, and as great as I see it, that protesters use the technology, I wouldn't necessarily say that the technology is in their hands. And Apple's move shows that quite clearly. That it's only to a certain extent in their hands, but the rest of the technology actually remains in the hands of the big tech companies, and they hold all the cards when it comes to deciding which apps one can install on their phones, on other devices, and that's a big problem.
You see, the thing is that they may hold all the cards in as much as they've got the technology, they know what to do with it. But authorities like those in China, and Leonard, I'll come to you in a moment, I'm not ignoring you, authorities like those in China have the ability to say, I'm sorry, we are going to strangle you, Apple, in this country, unless you do what we want.
But only if you're a company. If you use open source software, which doesn't have a company behind it, but which is written collaboratively across the internet, there is no company that you can strangle. And this is one of the most powerful tools that people are beginning to discover, is to use this open source software that can't be strangled in the same way.
Is this the sort of thing that Leonard was talking about?
Well, I don't think that...
Well, ask him. Let's ask him, because
It's
you can
not
explain what
open
open
source,
source software is.
Have they started using open source solutions, do you know?
It's very difficult for people to simply switch mobile phones. But I can guarantee you that young Hong Kong people are going to put that into their next purchase decision, and which mobile phone is going to make it easier for them to communicate with their friends. And it's very much true that you can pressure existing companies to adhere to the Chinese standards of a harmonious society. But there will be opportunities for future companies, for example, for chat apps or social media platforms, who simply ignore that Chinese market and say, we cater specifically to those people who want unhindered communications.
The other thing about this HKMapLive app, in a way, its selling point was also its detriment, in that it was just about Hong Kong. It was clearly about Hong Kong. It was very much focused on that. And when the app was first submitted to Apple for approval, as I understand it, Apple turned it down on the basis that it might end up being used to help people with illegal activities. However, if you look at another of the apps that the protesters are using very heavily, Telegram, Telegram's not just about Hong Kong. Telegram's a global app. It's used for many different things. And the police have had a much harder time, as I understand it, working on Telegram. And they have done things like just trying to identify people running groups on Telegram, go and arrest them and knock at the door, because they can't do with Telegram necessarily what they've done with HKMapLive and go and shut it down saying, well, this is infringing, because Telegram can turn around and say, well, we're global, we run this all over the world. So the localization of the app.
For those of us that aren't really tech savvy in this, explain how something like this works. You can talk about the open sourcing in a minute if you wouldn't mind, Glenn, but when it comes to sending encrypted messages, etc., would it not be easy for the authorities to send their own encrypted messages? Is it not a little bit like sort of working the spy system with invisible ink and and so on?
To a certain extent, I mean, just to distinguish these two apps. So HKMapLive, as I understand it, it pulled in information from lots of different places, news reports, Telegram groups, about where the police were, where the protests were, and it sticks it on a map. So
and the police could put out their own message saying this is where we are, but we're not
police could try and do that, but the information this app is using is information from people on the ground, people like Leonard, for example. So the police would have to sort of infiltrate that and put out false information. An app like Telegram, a lot of people don't realise about Telegram, it works on two levels. On the one hand, you've got open public groups that anyone can join, any of us could sign up to them, and you can get discussions about what's going on the streets of Hong Kong or on the streets of London. You can then also use Telegram to message in an encrypted way. So I could send you an encrypted message. Now, the police can look at the open and public groups and see what's being discussed there and maybe work out who those people are. But when you and I send each other an encrypted message using Telegram, it stays encrypted and the police are going to have a really hard time working out what's in that message.
Do you want to tell us a bit more about open source?
Just very quickly, I'm not sure whether they're still using it yet, but I'm sure they will do, because the idea is it's a decentralized movement. So if you don't have a center, you can't actually just arrest the center and shut it down. And in fact, practically every piece of software in the world today is open source. Your Android phone is open source. Many of the programs...
For people like me who don't really understand what that means.
Okay, open source...
Give me the Janet and John
Okay, so
version.
basically most programs like the ones we talk about for Apple are owned by Apple, they're written by Apple, they're Apple's secrets. Open source, you can actually read the actual underlying software code and you can use it freely, subject to certain rules, which basically say you have to share it. It's all about sharing. And the great thing about that is that it's a global collaborative way of making software that nobody can shut down as easily as you can send a letter to Apple's lawyers and say, stop it.
So I suppose what we're seeing here is Apple shut down for various reasons by the Chinese authorities. In a way, quite happy to accept it because that's the realpolitik of it. If it doesn't do it, it could get clobbered. But the protesters then finding a way around this with what Glyn is describing with this different type of software that isn't proprietary.
The challenge that we're seeing is that in the case of Apple, since Apple manufactures the phone and the software that's running on the phone and the App Store where people can download their apps from, and there's no easy way for users to install an app from a different source than from the official Apple App Store, Apple really has a lot of power here over people.
Well, total power, really. In that respect.
Yeah, and so if Apple decides to take off an app, open source or not, then at least for iPhone users, it's going to be very, very hard to do anything about it. But I was very intrigued by what you said about the possibility that people in Hong Kong may include that in their future purchasing decisions, and that may lead to people buying less iPhones and more phones running software that allows them to side load
so I'm getting around to this now. Even though it would be open source and therefore available if you happen to have a proprietary phone, it's difficult to put it onto that.
It's actually worse than that because we haven't talked about what happens if the authorities shut down the internet completely, as has happened in so many countries around the world. That's the ultimate recourse. If you're using these applications that depend on the internet, they could just shut down the internet.
What do you reckon, Leonard? Why would they not do that in Hong Kong? Would that lead to revolution there?
It would definitely have very severe side effects that would be similar to sending in the troops. Just the symbolic value of it and the disaster it would unleash on the Hong Kong economy, including the Hong Kong stock market, one of the largest stock markets in the world. Any kind of sanction that they have against the protests does have backlash. And there are some interesting other technologies people are using in these protests that have become very popular, especially for iPhones, the AirDrop that allows people to share memes and share information without having the internet. People share those things on their commute. They share those things in the queues in shopping malls. And it's also quite a fascinating way of people sharing information without necessarily relying on the internet and without a way for Apple to shut this down or even the censors to shut this down.
Yeah, I was quite interested to read, in doing some background on this, that the 2014 umbrella protesters thought perhaps they had been a little bit naive. Lessons, talking to those people that you know out there, Leonard, lessons have been learned from that?
The strategies that people have employed since 2014 have completely changed. It's mainly due to the erosion of trust in the political system. But when it comes to technology, it's mainly different technology being available. Telegram only really came up in 2014. It was being presented as this new way to have encrypted messages, WhatsApp or Signal didn't have encrypted messages back then. But what turned out today to be much more important is the anonymity that the internet provides. And apps like Telegram are so popular because A, they allow very, very large groups of people to come together and vote and share information. And B, they allow these people to protect their phone numbers, for example, from each other. Where unlike in a WhatsApp group, you don't need to know who the other people are in the group. So that I don't need to know who joins my group, but also the people inside of the group are protected from each other and can communicate safely.
Glenn, you wanted to say something, then
Yeah,
we'll open it up.
I raised the internet thing because pick up on something Leonard said. There is another way of creating a communication network called a mesh, whereby you just link your phones together without using the internet. For example, you might use Bluetooth. You can create your own local internet using Bluetooth. You know, we have Bluetooth connections on phones. And there's, in fact, it's a commercial product called Bridgeify.
That's only as good as far apart you happen to be physically.
Well, except that if you link to somebody who links to somebody who links to somebody, your message can get sent across the whole
it's like
city.
a chain.
It's a chain that is independent of the authorities. And I think we'll see much more of this kind of mesh network.
Would it be fair to say that the authorities are as frightened of this kind of protesting with the technology that it holds as they would be with physical threats these days?
I would say absolutely. I mean, this is the reason why in every autocratic country where there are protests or where there are sensitive moments, the first thing that governments do is shutting down or limiting access to the internet, because they see that that is a powerful tool. That's happened in places such as Cameroon. It has happened in places such as Hong Kong, obviously, in China all the time as a
Africa
system.
too, they keep on shutting down.
Yeah, and even in Turkey, you know, whenever you have a sensitive moment, the government tries to limit the access to the internet because they're afraid of the people exchanging information and knowing more than the government wants them to know.
I mean, I spoke to somebody who works for a big infrastructure company, and they provide a lot of the internet connectivity to Hong Kong. Now, they had not at that point been asked by any authority, Hong Kong or Chinese, to limit or shut down internet access. However, they were actively planning for what happened when that request came. How do we handle it from a PR point of view? How do we handle it from a tech point of view? What does worry me, though, about what Leonard said, wonderful as Telegram is, and I can join the group and I can chat with these 30,000 people or whatever, Telegram is not Twitter. On Twitter, the whole world can see what you're doing. And yes, that has disadvantages, and yes, that exposes people to surveillance, but it gets the word out. My worry is as the protesters go into these more encrypted, more secretive apps, they're limiting the amount of exposure their movement gets. They're limiting how many people hear about it. And I worry that you could look at this being the government has won. They've forced people into this particular channel, this particular avenue, because they're scared of surveillance. And that avenue has less exposure, less public visibility than things like Facebook and WhatsApp.
Hong Kong, as we know, one country, two systems. At one point, it will come entirely directly under Chinese rule. So I read this in the Financial Times. I'm going to read it out for you. The stakes for China's future and the way in which the world interacts with the superpower could hardly be greater. If the protesters prevail in wresting concessions for a more democratic future, it would indicate that Beijing's ready to tolerate diversity. If it cracks down again, as it did in 1989, Tiananmen, it will not only jeopardize the viability of Asia's financial hub, but also create a new crisis in relations between China and the West. The stakes are enormous here, not just for China and the people of Hong Kong, but also for other protest movements elsewhere.
I mean, I think this is why this is so important, what's happening in Hong Kong, is that we're seeing the future unfolding before us. And we will see a lot of these things happening elsewhere as technologies, ideas are actually borrowed and developed. And that's why it's a very important moment.
Well, take a look at the technological crackdown or the use of technology against citizens in the west of China, in Xinjiang province, against the Uyghurs. The Uyghurs Muslim minority, they have facial recognition cameras there that tell them everything they need to know about people that they may already distrust, and thereby they can use that as information against them. This could well be the future of what we're going to see in Hong Kong with this.
And in London, it's not just in Hong Kong. I mean, facial recognition is so powerful, so cheap, and becoming so ubiquitous. This is going to be the rule unless we fight it.
Why do you mention London?
Because we have one of the world's highest density of CCTV cameras. And if you retrofit those with facial recognition systems, just by getting computers looking at what those cameras see, you have a very effective surveillance system.
And Nana, do they not have facial recognition cameras in Hong Kong, and that people have been putting bags and bins over those things?
Hong Kong still has a very low density of cameras generally, but people do fight them. People do often just symbolically cut down camera masts. But more practically, they're protecting themselves with umbrellas to not be recorded. They're wearing face masks, which is now illegal at a protest, and they're literally smashing cameras.
Jan, digital rights, that's your bag. Are they the rights of the citizens when it comes to what is done with them digitally, or the rights of the digital entrepreneurs?
Digital rights is kind of a misnomer because in reality, we're talking about human rights in a digital environment. So it's not that we invent new digital rights. It's just the human rights that have already been there for decades and that are universally applicable. And we adopt them to a new situation where everybody is online.
And so how does this make you feel, this idea of the surveillance in Hong Kong, the use of technology, Xinjiang province, CCTV in London?
It frightens me. I've traveled to Xinjiang in 2018. It was one of the most gruesome days that I've spent anywhere, really. Just being there and having that feeling, because the Chinese government there doesn't even try to hide the cameras. You know, that's a little bit different from London, where they're like small and hidden somewhere. They're just in plain sight, big, on every street, every corner, in every side street even, and in front of every shop. And if there is one central entity like the government controlling all those cameras, gives them enormous amount of power. And it's true, we're seeing this in other countries too. Luckily, not many other countries want to pour as much resources into that as China does at the moment. But it's just a matter of time, unless we enact legislation that limits governments to their ability to do that. And in China, obviously, it's very hard.
Police are already doing facial recognition without asking any permission. They're scanning people in crowds. For example, at football matches.
They're doing a lot of that. They've been running trials over the last couple of years. Look, there is a note of optimism that I sound in all of this. It's quite bleak, but one thing...
We've got cameras on you, by the way.
No, one facial recognition now. One thing I do hear from people a lot is around the facial recognition debate in the UK is, well, we don't want to end up like China, do we? So the fact that China's gone so gung-ho in this, the fact that there are such egregious examples, as Jan's talked about, at least means people can see what happens when you go far down the line on this. So hopefully that will help people kind of row back. But that's why Hong Kong's such an interesting territory, because it's the borderland between the bit that we don't all want to go into, the kind of Chinese example, and the bit that used to be completely separate to China.
You know this old saw about not being able to put the genie back in the bottle? Well, the thing is, the technology is out there, and whether you use it for good or ill at the moment in London, you have no idea, with the power that this has, what might happen in the future, correct?
The problem with facial recognition, the thing people have to understand about this is your face is reduced to a number. That number's like your bank account number, your NHS number, your government gateway ID, whatever number. But you can't change the number. It stays with you your whole life. So when you say the genie won't go back in the bottle, we get one chance at facial recognition because we have one face. And if we screw it up, there's no face reset button, is there? You don't get a face reset. You only get one chance. That's why facial recognition is so important.
I mean, you talked about the fact that they were perhaps not very competent with this technology, the authorities, Leonard. We didn't go into that in very much detail, but I wonder if you think the protesters, with the technology they have, can always stay one step ahead of vast, autocratic, multi-million-dollar funded international institutions.
Yes, but of course, the government can try to restrict the internet. It can try to take these things away from them. And people very much fear that the reality of Uyghurs today is the future of Hong Kongers, and that these people will have to, and that there will be a great firewall, that people will have to use mainland-approved apps that install spyware on your phones, that maybe even officers from the government are being put into your classes at university or even your homes, as it's happening in West China. And in the case of West China, what we see is that even though the government has perfect control and perfect insight into everything that happens in people's life, the government is still not satisfied. They still fear this identity of the people. They still fear the ideas, the separate ethnicity, the separate language. And all of these things are things that might as well happen here, that even when the government has perfect control, they're still not going to be satisfied. And they're still going to try to put people into prison.
This is about a protest where people put gas masks on so they can't be seen, not just because of the gas. They put masks on, like the clown's masks behind me. You're sitting there. I've announced your name on television. You are in full view. You are one of the protesters. Are you scared about what could happen because of that?
Yes, I do also have to acknowledge that I'm in a privileged situation, that it's easier for me to leave if I have to than somebody who only has a Hong Kong SAR passport, that it is a bit easier for me, given that there are other people, more visible people, people at the front lines, for who the government is going to come first. But if this movement does not succeed, and if the government has its revenge, then it's going to get very uncomfortable for me as well.
If this is being used as a weapon of war, who will have the most firepower in the end?
It's always going to be the government. If they really want to, I think there is, because there are so much more resources. And also, what's interesting to keep in mind is that the government doesn't have to succeed 100%. To succeed with 100% of control. It's just everything they need to do is to make it hard enough for the larger majority of people. So, for example, the Chinese government tries to censor the internet, and the censorship will never be perfect, but it just needs to be perfect enough so that the large majority of people can't circumvent it, and then the government has won.
Well, listen, thank you very much indeed. It sort of reminds me of that line that came from IRA terrorists who tried to blow up Margaret Thatcher. You know, you were lucky today. You have to be lucky every day. We only have to be lucky once. And it is a terrifying thought, isn't it? We will follow with interest what happens in Hong Kong. Leonard, thank you very much indeed. Do stay in touch with us. Appreciate your time. It's fascinating. Thank you. Thank you all for coming on this edition of Roundtable. From me, David Foster, from the team that put it together, thank you very much. You can catch up with this and other Roundtables if you go to our YouTube channel. That is TRT World YouTube Roundtable. Until next time, from me, thank you. Goodbye.